It's now my great pleasure to introduce two people I've come to see as colleagues from the Center for a New American Security, Philip Carter and Catherine Kidder, who will present the results of the needs assessment. First, Phil Carter, who is Senior Fellow, Counsel and Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program at CNAS. His research focuses on issues facing veterans and military personnel, force structure, readiness issues, and civil-military relations. Phil's experience as an Army officer, political appointee, writer, business leader, attorney, and college professor, unprepared, sir, are detailed in your program. Catherine Kidder is the Bacevich Fellow at CNAS, working with Phil, also in the military program. She's a doctoral student in security studies at Kansas State University, so is working on her dissertation in her free time. But her writing for CNAS focuses on military retention and education, defense, budgeting, and foreign aid. Please help me welcome Phil Carter and Kate Kidder.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful, beautiful March afternoon to be a part of this event. I want to thank Michelle Monti in particular of the King Foundation for her leadership in bringing this together, and I would be remiss as the beneficiary of the sponsorship to not also thank the Hahn Foundation, the Hoagland Foundation, the King Foundation, the fund of the Dallas Foundation, the Meadows Foundation, the Smith Trust, and United Way of Metropolitan Dallas for their support of this project. We come to this as researchers from a Washington defense think tank that doesn't focus a ton on military personnel and veterans issues outside of our program. We have programs to look at the Middle East, at Asia, at cyber, robotics, and other things. But our program is different in that we focus on the human side of national security. Those men and women who join the military today as part of an all-volunteer force, those men and women who have served, and their families. And we feel this is a critical component of our national security, especially now when we rely on an all-volunteer force, and especially now in the dangerous world in which we live, more than ever. And the support for these men and women and their families that resides in communities is also important. Because although we serve in uniform in lots of different places, and I spent 3 years of my life here in Texas down the road at Fort Hood, we come home to communities. And so the support network and the infrastructure and the open arms that exist in the public and the private and the nonprofit sector here matters every bit as much as what we do for our men and women when they're abroad or when they're serving on bases like Fort Hood. And so we came to this project with that in mind and wanted to get a sense of what veterans face here in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, but also what infrastructure exists here to receive them and support them, leverage them, lift them up, and really take advantage of all that they bring to the community. And so Kate and I are going to walk through some of our methodology and our key findings and then some of our observations, and then segue into a panel discussion with some very distinguished guests here to talk with you all about this report.
All right, so taking a look at some of the broad questions that we brought to the table were, what are the issues that veterans are facing, and what are some of the services that are available at the federal level, at the county level, and among the nonprofit community that resides here in the Dallas-Fort Worth region and throughout the 13 counties. Walking through our research focus and methodology. So we wanted to look at what was the community structure, and then also what is the implication for the individual veteran or the individual service provider who's trying to meet the needs of veterans in the community. We defined the region as Collin, Dallas, Denton, Ellis, Hood, Hunt, Johnson, Kaufman, Parker, Rockwell, Somerville, Tarrant, and Wise counties, and then included also the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington metropolitan statistical area. We came to this too understanding that we're not the first ones to look at issues here in the Dallas region or in Texas writ large. We undertook a intense literature review to see what had been written already in the region. So we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants here. The University of Texas at Austin has done studies on mental health care for veterans throughout the state, as has the Texas Veterans Commission, looking at different issues that are out there. And then we undertook a lengthy data analysis, and you'll see a number of graphics that are developed throughout the report. And that's based on VA data. It's based on Department of Defense data. We also looked at the American Community Survey through the U.S. Census, and HUD, and a number of other regional data sets to figure out what exactly is the landscape that we're looking at of veterans in the region. I am happy to say that I see a number of faces out here of folks that we did interviews and working groups with, and that was one of the most informative things that we could have done here in the region, to find out what are the issues that actually face veterans, what are the issues that actually face service providers who are trying to reach those within the community. And then we also created a survey, which we distributed through a number of different methods to find out what were the perceptions that veterans held through the region. We asked, some of the usual demographic questions, but we also asked, how do you feel your life reflects now based on your military service? Are things better now than they were before? Or what are some of the areas where we could improve? Some of the key findings were that the Dallas veterans population is rather large, and not only is it a large population, but it's one of the densest communities of veterans throughout the country, and that has implications for the needs for services and the demands on the system here. There's nearly 386,000 veterans, and most of those are concentrated in the urban areas, but what that means is that there are different needs between the concentrated veterans populations in the Metroplex area and then the outlying rural counties. The VA spends $2.5 billion here in the region, which is 1.5% of all VA spending in the country, which is fairly significant when you realize that we're only looking at 13 counties. We see a split between compensation and pension, which tends to track more with our older veterans population, and then over $750 million on healthcare spending in the region. But we also see that we have a young population here in the expenditures that the VA pays out in GI bills here in the region for nearly $300 million. One of the things that we found, both that's demonstrated through the data, but that we found in conversations with folks out in the community who are trying to meet the needs of the veterans here, was that the Vietnam era population is really a burgeoning group of folks who are facing quite a bit of need here in the area, and that there are a number of programs that are trying to attack the issues that are facing our Vietnam veterans specifically. We also saw that female veterans face a number of issues in the region. Two of the areas that they're facing issues are access to health care, whether it be specialists or OBGYNs. And then also we saw a higher demand for the homeless female veteran population, and we'll outline some of that a little bit later. And then we also see that at the county level, the county really rules here in Texas. And so a lot of the authority that we see in maybe some other Western states that have more liberal governance schemes, where you see a lot of state involvement trickling down. Here in Texas, it's a lot of from the ground up, from the county level. So those are some of the bottom line upfront observations, and Phil's gonna walk us through some of the data that we actually saw as we were looking through the region.
Thank you, Kate. So as a former Army guy, I like maps, lots and lots of maps. As someone with toddlers, I like colors and crayons, and so I've tried to give you a little bit of all of that in here. There's a little bit of math, but we've tried to reduce those to crayons and maps where possible. And we have some Marines in the room who will appreciate the crayons as well. Sorry, Stephen. So, when we look at the population of veterans in America, we have a population of roughly 22 million across the country. It's a relatively large group as compared to other constituencies, but that's just 7% of the national population. A significant chunk of that lives here in Texas. About 1.6 million of the nation's 22 million veterans live in Texas. Texas has a rich tradition of military service, a rich tradition of people coming home to Texas or moving to Texas after service. The general split is that after service, a third of service members go home to where they came from, a third stay where they served, and then a third, go someplace new where the job is. Texas benefits from all three of those buckets. In absolute terms, you see the map on the left show where the largest county veterans populations are, and these shouldn't surprise you. These are the largest cities in Texas: San Antonio, Austin, a little bit around Waco, and then the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. In density terms, though, the map on the right shows you the per capita representation of veterans in all these counties, and there the map looks a lot more jumbled, as it should. Veterans spread out and make up disproportionately larger parts of the population in smaller counties. There are a variety of reasons why that's true, but predominantly it's because older veterans and veterans with families tend to move away from urban cores to the periphery as they reach family age than as they reach retirement age. And so the densest veterans populations, setting aside Killeen and San Antonio, are in the rural counties of the state. When we zero in and we look at this region, the same is true. The center of the DFW Metroplex, Dallas and Tarrant counties, have the most veterans, but the periphery have the densest veterans populations. And that means that for service delivery, you have a few different challenges to think of. If you're delivering volume and particular kinds of services that have a critical mass, the core might be where you locate your services, but there are a lot of veterans in the periphery, and disproportionately, you may have more service to deliver there relative to the civilian or non-veteran population. This was interesting to us, but we also know that in urban areas, whether Dallas or New York or anywhere else, you got to get below the county level to see where the veterans actually are. And so we're able to, for the first time with some new census data that came online, look at the census tract level data in the DFW area and pinpoint, in some cases to the block level, where veterans are. And I could put this up and try to suss out the patterns for you. There are really sort of two takeaways from this Rorschach test, which shows census level concentrations of veterans. One is that we see the same general pattern of core versus periphery, particularly in the top map, which shows all veterans, versus the bottom map, which shows post 9/11 veterans. But the second takeaway, I think, is even more significant, which is even though you see that general pattern of core versus periphery, there's an awful lot of mixture. You can't expect there to be one part of Dallas County or Tarrant County that's veteran heavy versus another, because there's a great deal of intermixing that goes on, and that also has profound implications for service delivery and also for this bigger idea of the civil-military divide. There really isn't a civil-military divide in this area. The community is one integrated fabric. And it's very hard to pull out, well, this is a vet-heavy area versus this one, particularly as you get closer and closer to the core of Dallas and Tarrant counties. So geography is one way we look at veterans. Another way is by age or period of service. And this chart shows a breakdown on the left by age and on the right by period of service. Nationally, the veterans population is pretty interesting in that it's an old population. It's a mostly white population. It's a mostly male population. It's dominated nationally by the veterans that served during the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the conscription era cohorts that served during those periods. That's not the case in this region. The cohort of veterans that lives in the DFW region is younger. The national average age is 65, so more than half of or roughly half of the nation's 22 million veterans are at retirement age or older. Here, the median age is closer to 50. And so that means the majority of your veterans are still in the workforce, still raising their families, still very much a part of the nation's vibrant economy and civic life in a way that's not true if you were to go to Phoenix or Southern California or Florida. It's a very different veterans population, and that has profound implications for service delivery as well as for what veterans are contributing to their local economy and society. And the same is true when you look at period of service. Vietnam era veterans are the dominant segment of this region's population, but coming up fast behind them are Gulf War I era veterans. I see Jeff in the back, and Gulf War II era veterans, my generation of veterans that are coming up behind them. And that's going to be a conveyor belt so that in 5 years, if you look at this, the picture is going to look even more skewed towards Gulf War era and after war veterans. And 10 or 20 years down the line, it's going to look completely skewed towards that population. So we also looked at some of the government activity in this space to get a sense both for what the VA was doing but also the government spending in the space tends to be a proxy for need and a proxy for demand among veterans for certain kinds of programs. Overall, this area benefits from a tremendous amount of VA spending, about $2.5 billion each year. Geographically, that's distributed in absolute terms where the veterans are. So the majority of that goes to Dallas and Tarrant County and Collin and Denton County in the north as well. But on a per vet basis, the map looks a little different. Dallas County captures more per vet than any county in the region, but some of the peripheral counties capture quite a bit too. And this can be a rough proxy for need to the extent that this primarily results from VA healthcare spending and VA disability compensation, which account for roughly 90% of VA spending. So where you see a lot of VA spending, there tend to be a lot of disabled veterans and a lot of veterans that use the VA healthcare system, and veterans who use the VA healthcare system tend to be disproportionately uninsured or having needs that are not met by the private healthcare system. When we looked at healthcare usage, again, not so much to know where the VA was delivering services, but more as a proxy for need, we saw a similar pattern. Very high levels of utilization in Dallas and Tarrant County, and when we looked at per patient spending, it was highest of all in Dallas County, significantly higher than other places. So if you're going to make an investment portfolio of support for veterans, particularly on the healthcare side, Dallas County would really be the epicenter of that portfolio. Health is one lens through which to look at veterans. Wealth is another. And on the wealth side, there's a fascinating picture to be told in the Dallas region, Dallas-Fort Worth region, about veterans. This area has a white-hot economy. You all probably know that better than I do. Veterans in this area do quite well, not just relative to the national average, but relative to non-veterans as well. And so the blue bars on the left show veteran income by county, and the red bars show non-veteran income by county. And you have these in your report, so if you want to see more detail or see them in less of an eye chart, they're all in there. In every single county in the region, veteran income exceeds the median income for non-veterans. That's significant. That doesn't mean that all veterans are doing great. It's an average, but it means that on average, veterans are doing quite well. And normally we'd say, well, that just reflects the fact that most veterans are older white men, and we know that older white men tend to do better in the economy. But remember that this area has a younger veteran census and a little bit more diversity based on the periods of service. So this is actually quite interesting because you wouldn't expect to see that large of a gap. It means that veterans are doing fairly well economically in this area, at least on average. There are needs on either side of the distribution, though, particularly among working class veterans or those who have housing or transportation issues that are exacerbated by the white-hot economy in this area. That housing prices in the core parts of the region tend to push people out to the periphery. The transportation issues of this region tend to make that a very difficult situation for folks that commute. And the cascade effect of economic success tends to drive need acutely at the bottom among working class veterans that are just getting their first toehold. Cost of living tends to hit you harder when you're starting your first job out of the service. It also disproportionately affects those that are in crisis, and homeless veterans are one of those groups. These two graphs show the number of homeless veterans in Texas and the number of homeless veterans in the two continuums of care here over the last 5 years. And generally it's a positive story, but the rates of decline in this area have not been quite as sharp or quite as uniform across the board as they have been across the country. Some of that is the fact that you all have done so well that the veterans that are still on the street are in some ways the hard cases. Some of it is that there's not a lot of housing stock. Some of it is some folks like Cindy Crane and others that we talk to say because it's such a hot economy, it's just very hard to find housing that you can use a HUD-VASH voucher or other things for. Nonetheless, this is one of those areas where even though most veterans do well, there are some that don't, and those who don't may struggle more because the economy and the region is doing so well. And the last piece of data or crayon chart I like to throw at you is one on the geography of this area. Someone who grew up in Los Angeles but then spent a lot of time in places like Dallas and Austin and elsewhere, the geography of need and the geography of transportation is always one of those things that pops up in my mind is very prominent in a place like this because it can simply add a lot of friction to daily life that impedes you from getting literally from point A to point B if you want to do something. And the triangle of work to home to service, whether it's service delivery or it's service that you might perform for your community, can sometimes be too hard. And in a place like Dallas or Los Angeles or San Antonio, it can be hard indeed based on the size and the congestion and the vitality of a region. And that is true here, that the friction inherent in daily life has an effect on the veterans in this region. It has an effect on their ability to get from place to place. It imposes a cost on them in terms of time and dollars. And this reverberates when they talk about whether they can get the services they need, whether they can get the VA appointment they need. Well, sure, I can get the VA appointment I need, but I can't take the hour it takes me to get there. Or I can, but over time that adds up to a lot of gas, that adds up to a lot of childcare or other factors. And so the geography of need here is something that has to be taken into account when delivering services or designing programs. I'm now going to turn it back over to Kate to talk about some of the high-level observations and conclusions from our study.
So outside of the VA here in the region, we saw that most efforts to serve veterans focused on the county or the community level, and that includes current collaborative and coordination models. And I think there's real strengths to be gained from that as the local community organizations are seeing the needs and responding to them maybe a little more rapidly than the federal government can. And so there's a lot of innovation that's happening. It also seems like there's a real spirit of service and service to veterans around here. So at every single working group that we had, we saw a lot of interconnectedness and folks learning more about each other's organizations in order to be able to provide veterans with more services and make sure that they're meeting all the needs. Female veterans faced specific difficulties here in the region. As we mentioned earlier, the healthcare was one of the big issues. But another issue that we saw was that our female homeless veterans, many of them with children, there aren't enough options for women with children for housing, for emergency shelter. Part of the problems that we saw were that we're trying to meet the needs of two very different populations. So we're trying to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our homeless veterans. And in some cases, it comes along with sex offense records and other issues that push women who are coming to homeless shelters with their children out. And so thinking through options of how we could create more female homeless veteran shelters in the region was one of the key issues that we heard in particularly a number of the rural counties. The Vietnam-era veterans continue to face difficulty. In part, what we've seen is that they're in an era or a period of life where they're transitioning from full employment into retirement. So for a number of them, this is the first time in their lives when they're really willing to access mental health care or they're finding a need for it. The region's economy is a plus for many veterans, but it also drives transportation, housing, and transition needs, as well as the need for financial literacy among veterans. So we have a number of veterans moving to the region who are getting a toehold into the vibrant economy. And one of the services they may not have experienced while they were in the military was financial literacy. And that can drive issues, once they're drawing an income, can drive issues related to homelessness and financial wealth. And then nonprofits and local governments here would benefit from additional capacity building. So one of the things that we heard a lot was that a number of these small, local, passionate nonprofits that are serving the needs of veterans are running on whether they're shoestring budgets or they're making sure that they're reducing their overhead as much as possible. But then they also need capacity building. So some of the things that larger nonprofit organizations that we see in DC have marketing departments and legal departments and folks who are professionals at writing grant applications. And that's something that we see here could really augment and help and assist the widespread efforts that are being made by the nonprofit community. I think the real takeaway here is the desire of folks in this room and in this community to really meet the needs of veterans, and that came across clearly no matter what part of the region we were in, and that was a really encouraging thing to see. And I really commend the audience here, particularly the folks who are coming from Congressman's office, from the VA, from the number of VSOs. We've done a number of needs assessments across the country, and sometimes it's hard to get all of these voices to the table. And so it really demonstrates the passion and the commitment to serving our veterans here in the region. So thank you for all the work that you're doing out there.
Thank you very much.